All right, everyone. My name is Storm Anderson, and excited to go through another one of the core components that we use here at Kumo Partners, and that is the comment history audit view that we incorporate into a lot of our apps. And so what this really breaks down and what I'm going to start following up with from this video is looking at this issue tracker, which is the app I have up now. This is an app that we use, and actually through the B2B options through the Azure B2B, we actually allow our clients to come in and give us different issues or enhancements related to some of the work we're doing for them. And so what you can see here is an example of where we have a table format here on the left. You can see these are our issues, our enhancements over time. I have some of the core fields, priority status, things of that sort. But the main piece, what I want to draw you to is the project history, or rather the issue history that you see right here on the right. So with the issue history, what's really beneficial about this, originally this app and kind of this process was being handled in Excel. And so being able to bring it from Excel, where we really couldn't track who was changing what, maybe if I left a comment and we were trying to have dialogue on an issue, there's no easy way to really see that from Excel. And so bringing it here, now you can see that not only can we easily reference some of the items that are open right now, we can also see what's happened to those items over time, seeing some of the formatting that we can bring in using rich text editors, some of the automated changes such as status in progress you can see here. And we can do some changes as well, even if the existing value and what they changed it to, attachment handling. There's a lot of great capabilities that come in when we start to look at how we can build on top of this. And so what I want to do today is focus on going back to the prior video that we did, which was working with the modal component, building out this data table format here. And so this was the original take on it. Let me switch. Where we left it. And so if you hit new request, we had a modal pop up with some fields, and then we had the basic data table showing data here. So what we're going to do today is go through the process of transforming this into looking a little bit more like our issue tracker here. And so we'll reformat the table in the next video, start looking at some of the different filter and sorting capabilities that are built out here. But today we're going to be working on the issue view. So we'll go back to my app and let's get started. So from this view, there's a few things that we're going to be doing. First, like I said, we're going to be reformatting the data table to be more on the left-hand side here, and then we'll be incorporating the comments here on the right. But before we do that, we have to create the list that'll be storing the comment history related to this. And so if I go to my SharePoint site that I was using, we'll see we have a few lists here. And so project request is the main list that we're working with. And then I built out prior example of what the project history looks like, as we're calling it. This could also be called comments or anything of that sort. And there's really just three simple columns, really two that we'll be adding to this. And so we'll be reusing the title field here. We'll be adding a multi-line text. So in this case, you can see that this is a multi-line, and we do include the rich text option here. This could depend on whether or not you're having people look at this data in SharePoint or not. If we are keeping them to PowerApps, this really doesn't affect it either which way. But for our case, we'll just turn it on. And then the final column we'll add here is actually a lookup column to the table or the data that we're actually adding comments and history to. And so when you go to add column, you won't see it here in the quick add option. But if we go to more, that's where we'll see our lookup. And this is where we will call this, say, project. I typically like to keep the name of the entity that it's pointing at. And then we would select the project request here. In this case, I already have a column that's doing this, but that would be pointing at project request, and then we would use the title in that column. You could also change this to a project code or something else similar to that, but for our sakes, we're just going to use title. And so when I go back, that's where you can see that this does connect to a prior project that was created. So once we create our project history or comments list, Let's go back to our Power App. Let's go to add data, go find your SharePoint connection. And we'll go to the site. In this case, I do already have it, but I could reselect it right here and I would connect. So once we have our history table here alongside our data table that we're going to use, we can now start to work. All right, so let's start reorganizing, incorporating that comment. So first, we're going to just, this is what it will look like, but we can come back to that. So first, let's go ahead and select our data table, and we're going to drag this to be, I'd say maybe somewhere around 2/3 to half the size of the screen. That would just be on my own kind of preference and experience working with it, but certainly we could make this layout differently depending on your own personal interest. But I like to see that the table's here on the left, maybe make some quick adjustments. All right. So now that we have our table, we can start to build out the section here on the right. And so we're just going to build a simple outline of what this can look like. We'll go and add a just general header here. And this is going to be request history. We're going to add a gallery. And when you're adding this gallery, make sure that it's this blank flexible height gallery. The difference being that this will actually expand with the comment. So when there's more information, it'll make sure that the gallery card will actually expand with more rather than being stuck and having to scroll necessarily. So I'll create that. I'll drag that over here as well. All right. So I'm probably going to do a little bit more resizing on this, but for now, just to know where this is, I'm also going to outline this light gray for the moment. And maybe just to make this stand out just for the sake of the demo, I'll make that color. All right, so now that we have our gallery, we can also add the remaining components, which is we need something that will add the comment. And so in this case, you can use just a normal text input, or I like to use the rich text editor. So I'll drag that down here. And this is a good example of where you start to think about some of the layout considerations. One thing that always frustrates me, you'll notice, is that if you do bring the rich text editor too thin, this will fall to the next line. And so I always like to try and make sure that you're getting the maximum amount of space here. And so that usually is what guides my decision on how wide to make this formatting. And so I'll just bring that here. Maybe if we needed more columns, we could always come back to this and try and reorganize it. But for now, I'll just make this easy enough to follow. All right. And last but not least, now that we have the rich text editor, we'll finally just add a button. And this will be our button to add the comment. That down. All right. So now let's configure our gallery. So this is just querying any data that is related to the core list. So if that's projects and you're following along with me, that would be filtering the new list, the project history list, off of that lookup column that we have. And thankfully, for a few years now, the lookup column is delegated when you are looking against large sums of data. So that does work to our advantage to incorporate that instead of trying to use like a single line workaround necessarily. So if we are going to filter, we're going to filter on the data source. So it's called project history here for me. I'll filter there, and the name of my column is project. And so whenever you're filtering off of a lookup column, this is actually taking the form of a record, and that record has value and ID. And so you'll notice if I do dot, that's where .id, .value. If we want to make sure we're sticking to how the delegation and filter query works behind this, we want to always make sure to do it off of the lookup field .value and not the .id. So we have project.value equals, and now this is where we need to get the selected row from our data table. And so we could certainly point just directly to the data table 1.1, and then that's where we can also use the data table 1.1.selected. That gets us the individual row, and then that's where we have the title of the project. And also make sure that whenever you're doing lookup value references in your filter, that you are using the same field that you have showing as the main field here. So if this was ID, then you would want to make sure to be doing data table dot selected dot ID, even though this would still say project dot value. That would be the same if this was project code or any other field. You would always want to make sure that this is staying consistent. But in that case, we can just close this off. And there's one more thing about this that I typically adjust, and rather than pointing directly at the data table, especially as the data table might change or be filtered, some of that change will also affect what is the selected value for the data table. And so rather than pointing directly at the data table, typically when working against a table of records such as this, I will create a global variable to hold that reference. And so that's where I will say for the columns on select, I'll do set selected project. And then I will still do data table 1.1 dot selected, because that is still the record. But now, rather than referencing data table 1.1 selected, I can come back over here and say selected project, and that'll keep the reference consistent. One final thing for the data table is that when we do have, certainly you can click on this and you'll see that it does change, but I do like to add the feature which is hyperlink, and that way then it gives the click handling experience, which I just think looks a lot better, and UI is more understanding for the user that this is something they would be clicking and would expect the the mouse clicker to show as well. Finally, just to show that that is coming through, because we don't have any gallery data just yet, request history. Let's change this to request. Let's go request number, selected project, ID. And so that's where you can see number 1, number 2, and we could change that out for the title if we wanted, and we could even incorporate more fields if it made sense to. But okay, so now that we have the field or the general components here for the gallery, there's just one more thing we need to do, and that is add the items within the gallery itself, just so we have a sense of what this is going to look like before we start testing. And so what we add, just to keep this simple again, is we will add a label. And this is going to be pointed at the title. So one thing we could maybe do here is add some color differentiation. Storm Anderson added a comment. Let's actually make this semi-bold. And then for the comment itself, we can add a HTML text. And so this, being separate from the title, I'll make as a white background. And so it doesn't have a text property, it has an HTML text property. That is where I'll make this item.comment. All right, almost there. Now let's just add one more field, or one more label rather, and this will just be pointing at the created date, just so we can understand, hey, how long ago this was, and use that in some of the sort behavior that we'll incorporate with this as well. Since this is a little bit smaller, I'm going to take off some of the padding, maybe italicize this. And so now that we have the components, there's a few more adjustments we need to make. Since this is going to be potentially growing over time, and we have the flexible height gallery here working for us to do that, on the comment label or component, we want to make sure that we're using the auto height. And so because of that, we also need to then make anything that's below that because this might be, 50 pixels, 200 pixels. It might be someone's essay or thesis. And so how we can make this label dynamic based off of that is to make a formula or use an expression for its Y property. And what we do here is we'll say HTML text2 dot Y plus HTML text2 dot height. And now you can see that that comes to the bottom. If I added maybe say a little space, +5, +10, you can see that that adjusts accordingly. So now we have our basic item. Let's just make this a little bit smaller as well. Okay, we're almost there. We can see that there's some existing data for this demo that I had in here. So let's now hook up the comment feature. So we'll get rid of this default functionality or the verbiage there. We could add some additional spelling or additional information, but we'll keep it blank for now. What we're going to focus on is the onSelect. And so here, what we're going to do, since we're not using a form to submit this data, that's where then we're going to fall to the patch function. And so the patch function is going to be updating data against the project history list. We're going to always be creating a new comment. Certainly we could work through how we could make past comments editable, but for now, if we are patching a new item, this is how you get the default properties for that data source, and this is how it knows and tells the patch function that this is a new row that's being created. Finally, we just are going to then give the properties that we're updating. So title, this is this information right here. So the format I typically like to use is using the current user's full name, and then adding just a simple phrase such as added a comment. The next property is the comment itself. As you can see here in the IntelliSense, that's going to point at our rich text editor 2.html text. And last but not least, now we need to patch the lookup property, and that is project. So when we're patching a lookup property, there's the record schema that I talked about earlier, which follows the ID value. And so thankfully, we can just recreate that manually, especially using the global variable that I created earlier, selected project. And so I'll do the notation value. This points at the selected project title, and the ID, uppercase I, lowercase d in this case. This is also going to point at the selected project, but instead it's going to point at the ID. And so I'll close that off. Need one more. There we go, curly bracket. And now you can see that I can format. We have all three of the properties there. So the final things I add to this is just to do a notify. Your comment was submitted, and do a success for just 1 second. And let's go ahead and try and test this out now. So looked into this more to demonstrate. I'll use some of the rich text features. Example 1, example 2, and let's go ahead and add. And now you can see that that came through. And so if I switch through, you can see that that still removes everything, and this keeps that working. One additional thing that we could look at here is resetting the rich text editor. Unfortunately, there is not an out-of-the-box way to reset this. If you were using a text input field, you could use reset and then pass in the component that you would be resetting. Test this again. Oh, what do you know? Actually, that does work now. So maybe that was something, a subtle change they made, but lo and behold, this does reset. So the final adjustment we'll add I'm getting surprised even as I try and teach other people. You can reset the rich text editor, which is great. So there's no need to work around. You can just pass that in. And finally, the adjustment here is rather than filtering just by default, which as you can see is putting all the old items at the bottom, or rather the new items at the bottom, I actually like to reverse the sort of this. And instead, I would say created, and it would be descending. Now we can see our item at the top. It expands if it gets bigger, and it just scrolls through past time. All right, so that is our video. That's a simple way to highlight how we can include this comment functionality. We could certainly build off of that and start to look at how we were doing some of the additional features, such as looking at status changes. The next possibility would also be looking at an assigned field, potentially a due date as well. So that's something that we'll save for the next videos, and slowly but surely we'll be building this out to resemble some of the more complex applications that we work with every day. So thank you for watching and look forward to the next video.